morning, everyone. Happy April. So happy to see you this morning. Welcome you joining today's class, Savor at Home and Learn, Home Hardening and the NHD. I'm Pauline Lam from Kota Roti, your 2021 Co-Chair Education Committee, West and Gabriel Valley Realtors. A friendly reminder, all participants will be muted in the meeting. And should you have any questions, please enter it into the chat box. Speaker will answer it during the Q&A section. This section is being recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel, West and Gabriel Valley Realtors. Now, I'm so glad to invite our Co-Vice Chair of Education Committee, Ms. Sylvia Rosage, to introduce our very special speaker, Mr. John Wax and Chris Wood. Now, Sylvia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pauline. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our April special, Safer at Home and Learn event. Okay, today we have our John Wax from SnapNHD. You all know him. He's been an affiliate with our board for over 19 years. He said, I think he's 20, right?
Yes.
20 years. And so he brought along with him a special guest. His name is Chris Woods, Chief Compliance Officer, SnapNHD. And he has some very important information for us today, home hardening and the NHD. It's fairly new to us, realtors and brokers alike. So here we are. I'm gonna let John Wax introduce Chris Woods with all the information he has for us. Thank you, and take it away, John.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm John Wax with SnapNHD Natural Hazard Disclosures. I brought a very, very wonderful person, Chris Woods. Chris has been in the industry for over a decade, working with many brokerages throughout the state, helping them with the seller's compliance disclosure information. He's also been a big part of Berkshire Hathaway and developing their NHD products and helping them be compliant with that. And he is here to help you be compliant as well and understand this new home hardening and the NHD and how that affects the new car form and all that kind of information. And without further ado, take it away, Chris.
Today, we're going to talk about home hardening, defensible space. We're going to talk about the car form, and then we're going to talk about some pitfalls in the NHD and which information you want to rely on in an NHD for the home hardening disclosures, which can be solved with the car form HHDA. So we have those three sections we'll be going over today. I'll take a brief pause between each of those sections to answer questions. So if you guys do have any questions, like it was previously mentioned, please put those in the chat box and we will get them addressed. Starting off, we're going to take a look at the disclosure, the home hardening and defensible space disclosure that we include in our SnapNHD report. We're just going to talk about some general background on what is home hardening, what is defensible space, and give you guys a couple of key resources you guys can look to going forward, just to remind yourselves of what this information is as it comes up for you. So starting off, CAL FIRE in 2007, they were charged with putting together various maps for use in many industries, but one of which being the real estate industry. They were charged with determining where a local agency was responsible for fire protection services, where a state agency was responsible, and where a federal agency was responsible. And then on top of that, within that state responsibility area, they were also charged with determining the various fire hazard severity zones in the area for which CAL FIRE is responsible. And so we have those two separate maps that we use for various things in the NHD, and they play a part in determining whether or not sellers have additional home hardening disclosures with their transaction. So we've been throwing around this term home hardening here a little bit already. What is home hardening? Home hardening is a series of retrofits as determined by CAL FIRE that make a home less vulnerable to nearby wildfires. If a wildfire isn't right up next to the home, it is still possible for a structure fire to start. Wildfires throw off a number of embers that can start a structure fire if they hit a vulnerable part of a home. Some of these retrofits are less expensive, some of them are a bit more expensive, but they all kind of make sense. So just going over a couple of those examples. One of the first ones that CAL FIRE recommends is covering vents, covering rain gutters with metal mesh of like 1/8 to a 16th of an inch in an opening. The idea here is to minimize the places that embers can go and land where there's going to be flammable debris, such as, like pine needles or dried leaves in a rain gutter, or working their way into an attic where they can get to insulation and start a fire from inside of the attic. Replacing wood eaves and soffits with less combustible material, installing dual pane windows with one pane at least being tempered glass that helps with heat transmission, and the tempered glass helps the window maintain structural integrity if it is impacted by nearby debris. And then you start getting to some of the more expensive retrofits to make a home less vulnerable, such as remodeling the exterior of a home that has wood siding with either a treated wood siding or stucco, rebuilding a wooden deck out of a deck material that isn't as combustible as wood, such as treated wood or something synthetic, or replacing a wood or shingle roof with a tile roof, a composition roof, or again, something that just isn't as flammable where an ember could land on it and is not immediately going to catch that particular part of the structure on fire. For this list and for other examples, you can see in our report, we have this website that's listed here, readyforwildfire.org. We'll mention that again here in a little bit. And the readyforwildfire.org website is maintained by CAL FIRE. They have great examples on there. They have all kinds of images and explanations as to what the home hardening retrofits are. They talk about defensible space requirements in there, which we'll get to in a minute. And it's a great resource for you guys if, a year from now, 2 years from now, you want to come back and have a refresher on this, or your clients have questions. These links, which we will always have in our NHD, are a great resource for more information on these particular topics or for a refresher down the road. So we've talked a little bit about home hardening, how to make a home less vulnerable to a nearby wildfire, but that isn't a complete picture in protecting a home from a wildfire. The flip side of that coin is defensible space. And now, defensible space, somewhat self-explanatory, but we're going to get a little bit into the requirements for it. And the idea behind defensible space is twofold. The first one is to not have a bunch of fuel next to the house so that if a wildfire does come by, it's much more difficult for the fire to get up next to the home because it lacks the fuel it needs for that fire to get next to the property. And then by extension of that, it secondarily allows space for firefighters to stand between the home and the fire to fight that fire and make sure that the structure doesn't catch on fire. So there are 2 zones that are referred to in defensible space, and each one has a little bit different requirements within those zones or recommendations from CAL FIRE. The first zone is the nearest 30 feet from the structure. In San Diego County, they've actually extended that distance to 50 feet, but we're going to refer to this as zone 1 being the nearest 30 feet from the structure. And CAL FIRE has a couple recommendations on what to do within this nearest 30 feet. One of the big ones is removing dead plants, grass, weeds, leaves, etc. from the ground, and especially make sure it's out of the rain gutters. So it's very flammable material. It's very easy for that stuff to catch on fire. And as such, it makes it very easy for a fire to travel from outside of that zone up next to the structure. You want to remove branches that are overhanging from the structure itself. So within that nearest 30 feet from the home, you want to make sure that branches are not hanging over the house. Not only is this a structural issue if the branch was to hang on, fall onto the roof, but if that branch is also on fire, that can lead to a structural fire on top of just structural damage. And on that note, you also want to make sure that branches are at least 10 feet away from chimneys, because that also makes them a possible ignition source for a fire. You also want to remove vegetation from under decks so that you don't catch a deck on fire, which can transfer to a structure fire. And then one recommendation that we're going to see in both zone 1 and zone 2 is this idea of creating separation or creating space between bushes, trees, and other items such as patio furniture. The idea here is so that if one particular set of bushes or something catches on fire, that fire has more difficulty traveling to another section to catch more stuff on fire as it goes. And so CAL FIRE recommends both horizontal and vertical space between these bushes and trees. So if you have a couple bushes that are set together, create some space before you put some more bushes next to them so that if one particular section does catch fire, it's much more difficult for that fire to go from a bush to a tree over to another tree and slowly work its way up toward the home. So we talked about zone 1, which is the nearest 30 feet to the home. Zone 2 is that separate section of 30 feet to 100 feet from the home, or in San Diego, 50 feet from 100 feet to the home. This second section has looser restrictions as far as what the requirements are for defensible space. CAL FIRE understands that a lot of the homes that are going to be in these higher fire hazard areas are in more mountainous and wooded areas, and you're not necessarily going to maintain huge amounts of property around it to keep it completely clear of debris. The recommendation in zone 2 for creating defensible space is to keep grass below 4 inches tall. Again, maintain space between trees and shrubs and other trees and shrubs. And you can allow fallen needles and twigs, bark, things of that nature to collect on the ground. But CAL FIRE recommends that it's no more than a depth of 3 inches. For some reason, they have determined that below that is safe, and above that, it's a sufficient fuel source to actually become a fire hazard. Again, all this information and even some fantastic visuals for defensible space and the requirements are available at the readyforwildfire.org website. And as we have here in our NHD, you'll have the link direct to that particular page. So if you have questions or you want a refresher on information specific to defensible space, we have that link provided for you so that you guys can go and refresh your information if you do have a home that shows up and you haven't dealt with it, like a year or two from now. This is going to be the first section where we can take a quick break. If you guys have any questions regarding home hardening, just generally, or defensible space, please post those in the chat. Otherwise, we're going to move on to the CAR form. We're going to get into some of the specifics regarding the disclosures and when these disclosures are required. So if you guys have any questions, please post them in the chat. Otherwise, we will move ahead to talking about the CAR form. We're going to bounce around here a little bit. There is a little bit more information that is in our NHD here. We're going to come back to it in a second. But let's talk about the CAR form. As you guys know, California Association of Realtors, I'm sure that all of you guys are members of the California Association of Realtors. And as you guys know, CAR puts out a large number of forms that cover just about everything that can come into a real estate transaction. So of course, new seller disclosures are going to have a CAR form to satisfy those disclosure requirements. Back in August, we were working very closely with CAR as to how NHD companies can work with real estate agents to determine whether or not sellers of property would have these additional seller disclosure requirements. Because you guys do a lot of things in a real estate transaction where you guys are getting information about a property. But as far as hazards go, for the most part in a transaction, it's a little bit outside of your guys' realm to go research, high or very high fire hazard severity zones, which is where CAR turned to us and was like, hey, are you guys going to be willing to help out on this information? Because for us, this is second nature. And it totally makes sense for you guys to shift the responsibility of making that determination from yourselves just to limit your liability and limit the seller's liability. As normal natural hazard disclosure providers, this is normal for us. This is something that we do every day. It's right inside of our wheelhouse, and we're more than happy to help you guys out with making some of these determinations. And so we'll see a couple spots in here where the NHD works alongside the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory to help you guys navigate this situation. So getting into the form, we're going to talk about this first section here. If you're trying to determine whether or not this property or this transaction is going to have these additional seller disclosures, this is the particular section of the CAR form that you want to look at to help make that determination. It kind of spells it out for you here, and we're going to go through it. For a seller or a transaction to have these additional disclosure requirements, they're specifically for sellers of residential property of 1 to 4 units. So we're talking about cabins, might have some duplexes, but your traditional residential properties that would normally require an NHD. You guys will already know that one. That one's pretty standard. But yeah, so it's only for sellers of residential properties of 1 to 4 units. The second section here is it's only for properties that are constructed before January 1st, 2010. This date is significant because on January 1st, 2010, the Wildland Urban Interface building codes became a standard part of the building code in the state of California. And as a part of that new building code, all of the home hardening retrofits that we talked about previously became a standard part of building a property in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. So any property constructed after 2010, there aren't going to be these vulnerable areas that are required to disclose, because for that to be a permitted property in a habitable structure, it was already going to have those features built into it anyway. So if the property was constructed after January 1st, 2010, this disclosure isn't required. The third section is whether or not a property is located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. Like I said, this was what I was talking about a little bit earlier about how we worked with CAR and said, hey, we're more than happy to work with real estate agents about giving them the information they need to determine whether or not a property is in a high or a very high fire hazard severity zone. Like I was saying, it's a little bit out of the ordinary for you guys in your standard, research for a property, but for us, this is second nature information. And so we went through and we created a disclosure specific for whether or not a property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone to specifically clue in on this particular section of whether or not a seller has additional seller disclosure requirements. So jumping back over to our NHD, this was the additional disclosure that we were looking at just a minute ago. Down here at the bottom, where we actually make our disclosure statement, you will see our actual determination on the property, and it's specific for this particular section of the law applicability of whether or not the seller has these additional disclosure requirements. We very clearly want to say what, like based on the maps reviewed, the subject property is or is not located in a high or very high fire hazard severity area. We were very careful to make sure that we matched up the language in this disclosure to match the language that is used in the civil code so that it wouldn't be too confusing and you guys would know, hey, this is specifically what we're talking about, whether the property's in this high or very high fire hazard severity zone, whether it meets this particular piece of criteria for determining whether or not a seller has those additional disclosure requirements. And the last section is whether or not the transaction is going to use a real estate transfer disclosure statement. There's a number of different situations out there like probates, REO sales, things of that nature, where the sellers are not going to do a real estate transfer disclosure statement because they don't have actual knowledge of the property. It's the same situation for this disclosure. If the property or the transaction is not going to include a real estate transfer disclosure statement, the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory is not going to be required for that transaction. Just to wrap that up and to put it very simply, sellers are going to have these additional disclosure requirements. They're selling residential property of 1 to 4 units constructed before January 1st, 2010. That property is located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone. And that transaction is going to require the transfer disclosure statement. If you meet all of those requirements, the seller is going to have those additional disclosure requirements for the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory. Good news though, if you do have those additional seller disclosure requirements, CAR has a form for you to handle all this stuff. And so we're going to walk through the rest of it. Briefly going through the rest of this top section, there are some little bits of information in here, but I really wanted to spend most of my time on that law applicability section and then talking about the actual disclosure down here at the bottom. But not to ignore this middle section. CAR here is specifically calling out, hey, use your NHD company, use a natural hazard disclosure company, specifically SnapNHD, to determine whether or not a property is in a high or a very high fire hazard severity zone. We have that information in our NHD that is specifically to be used for determining whether or not the seller has these additional disclosure requirements. And there's no reason you can't get this information as early as possible. With SnapNHD, with like no financial risk to you guys, you can order a report before you even go to your listing appointment. Like, hey, this property is up in the mountains. Let's see whether it's in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone or not. Call John, call your rep, and ask them, hey, can I just get an NHD for this property? I'm going to head out to a listing appointment. I just want to make sure, and just see what the situation is for this property. That way you can address this in the listing presentation, or hey, best case scenario, after you've signed that listing agreement, you can have this conversation with your sellers then about some of the information in the home hardening disclosure and advisory seller disclosures. There are some situations which are outlined here in section 4 where a transaction may want to include the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory in a transaction, even though the property may not be in a high or very high fire hazard area. If the property's near like mountainous area, wildlands, areas that are unmaintained, it might be prudent to include this information anyway. And when you use SnapNHD to order your NHDs, we'll include the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory when applicable. And if you want it in additional situations, we can add the form, and we'll even take care of this, section 3 for you here. It's very standard in car forms to see a checkbox that's going to modify a statement. We have one of those here to where if a property is not in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, but you want to use this additional seller disclosure, you can check this box so that it's not contradicting information in other places in the report. And we'll take care of that information for you and check that box as appropriate. Let's actually talk about the meat of this now. So like we kind of know when to use the form, but what does it actually mean? What is the actual disclosure about? What does the seller have to do? And that's where we get to section 2 here. This is the actual disclosure through AB 38. This first paragraph here is just a static paragraph. That's an actual disclosure that is outlined that has to be made according to AB 38. And you will see that they reference that readyforwildfire.org website again. That's maintained by CAL FIRE. So that's going to be a resource that's going to stay around and is always going to be a great resource for home fire hardening information as well as defensible space. The second section is where your seller actually has to interact with this disclosure and make the disclosure on the property. So one thing I really want to point out though is this word aware. And CAR has made it very clear that their interpretation of AB 38 is that this is merely a disclosure of what the seller is aware of. This is only what the seller knows about. The seller does not have to investigate these different areas of their home to try to make a determination on whether or not they need to make this disclosure. This is only for specific or for what they know about. This is only for what they are aware. Another point that I want to make regarding these features and what boxes do get checked here, they are not retrofit requirements or point of sale retrofit requirements. If the seller checks these boxes, it does not mean that they are going to have to go through and actually make changes to the property. So yes, if they do have a wood shingle roof, they are going to have to check. Let's see, where is that one in here? They are going to have to, check the box for section B here regarding roof coverings, but they are not going to have to replace the roof at the time of the sale. So check these boxes, or have your seller check these boxes of, for the vulnerabilities that they are aware of, but no, they are not going to be point of sale requirements. And these are just the listed various different home hardening features that were mentioned in AB 38 as recommendations from CAL FIRE that we covered previously. We got a question here from Frankie. Do all properties need to disclose the HHDA by listing agents? No, not all properties need to disclose this information. Looking at the law applicability section here of the HHDA, it specifically states that it's only for residential properties of 1 to 4 units that are constructed before January 1st, 2010, that are located in a high or a very high fire hazard severity zone, and are in transactions that are required to include a TDS. So it's only if you meet all 4 of those requirements is it required that the seller make these additional disclosures. If you answer no to any one of those 4 criteria, the additional seller disclosure requirements are not required though you may still want to add them. That's more of a conversation between you and getting back here to the additional disclosure, the actual disclosure portion of the car form HHDA. There is this third section in here where they're talking about a final inspection report. Very explicitly want to point out that it says if checked. This is not a required addition to the seller disclosure requirements. But in many situations in a real estate transaction, sellers and agents will defer information to industry professionals so that they can put that information into the transaction so that those people are carrying the liability and you're not, as an agent kind of stepping outside of the scope of your responsibility to try to make determinations upon which you're going to be liable if they are incorrect. So CAR has put into the form an option for a final inspection report that is typically done by CAL FIRE and gives you guys a space to put in writing where that report can be found so that that disclosure can be signed in the transaction so that you guys have proof that the buyers received that information. CAL FIRE will come out to properties and they will do a defensible space inspection, which does include the vulnerabilities of the home to some extent. However, this optional inspection report, it can take time for this particular inspection to be completed and delivered to sellers of property. Earlier, I mentioned, getting your NHD with SnapNHD before you even go to a listing agreement, which might sound like you're really putting like the cart before the horse, but it'll allow you to get the information regarding whether or not the property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone and whether or not these disclosures are going to be required of your seller so that your seller can, as early as possible, get that inspection scheduled with CAL FIRE. The inspectors are seasonal. They're only around from like April to October, and the other 6 months of the year, they don't have those as many inspectors on staff. And so it may take even longer for an inspector to get out to that property, do the inspection report, and provide it to the sellers of the property. So there's no risk in ordering an NHD at the time of the listing agreement. If for whatever reason it doesn't matter, it's not going to work out, you just let us know. You can cancel the report. You don't even have to pay for it. Nobody has to pay for it. You guys can just cancel the report and move on. But we want to make sure that you guys have the information you guys need early in your transaction so you can make your transaction go as smooth as possible. And this is one of those situations where you want your information as early as possible. So your sellers can schedule that final inspection report from CAL FIRE so that you guys have the time to get that completed before and into escrow, before escrow closes. Because if you guys are like day 10, day 12 in a 30 to 45 day escrow, it's next to impossible to get one of these reports, these inspection reports scheduled through CAL FIRE and actually completed and have that included in your guys' escrow. So get that information early and ahead of time. But like I said, this is an optional disclosure. You don't have to include this, but it may be a good idea going forward if you want that information. One of the questions that I frequently get regarding these final inspection reports is, will a home inspector, do one of these inspection reports? And as I understand it, this is a little bit outside of the scope of a home inspection. However, a home inspector might be able to comment on the vulnerable features of a home that may need to be hardened according to, or may want to be hardened according to CAL FIRE. So looking at some of these home hardening features here, having this information early as a seller, having this disclosure filled out and given to the buyers early in a transaction gives the buyers time to review this disclosure so they can ask a home inspector who's actually been to the property and is an expert in, researching and inspecting these various features of a home. They can ask those questions directly to the home inspector and make an informed decision. And as a real estate agent, you're not picking up the liability of trying to interpret which features are on a home, what was included in the home inspection report, and trying to answer your buyer's questions. But having this information early allows your buyer to go direct to the home inspector and to save you guys some liability exposure. So that's a general overview, and probably a more detailed overview of the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory from CAR. Again, we're going to take our second short break here. If you guys do have any questions, please post them in the chat and we'll address those. After this, we're going to go to the NHD. We're going to take a look at a couple of pitfalls in the NHD and where to look for the information specific to the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory so that you guys know where to go and how to navigate some of this information. All right, we're going to move forward. We'll talk about some of these pitfalls. And if you guys do have any questions, we can always come back and address those. So let's take a look here at a sample NHD that we ran on a separate property from the report we were looking at in the beginning part of our presentation here. But we're going to focus on a couple of the disclosures that are in the natural hazard disclosure statement. As you guys were aware, the natural hazard disclosure statement is the same through most companies because it is written out in the civil code as specifically, hey, this is what the natural hazard disclosure statement is, and this is what you guys should use. In that statement, they have 6 questions, 2 regarding flood, 2 regarding fire, and 2 regarding seismic hazards. So we're going to talk about the 2 regarding fire and why they're not great determining disclosures for determining whether or not a seller has these additional seller disclosure requirements. So we have a very high fire hazard severity zone disclosure, which we will come back to, and we have a wildland area disclosure. We're going to start here. So a wildland area is a state responsibility area. It's an area in which CAL FIRE or the state are responsible for fire prevention and protection activities. This would be things like, clearing particular areas, creating fire breaks, just to kind of minimize the spread of wildfires. We were talking about this earlier at the beginning of our presentation. CAL FIRE was charged with determining, which areas the local areas agency was responsible for fire protection, where the state was responsible, and where the federal government was responsible. This wildland area is, where the state is responsible for these activities. Like I mentioned earlier, within the state responsibility area, CAL FIRE was also charged with determining the fire hazard classes in the state responsibility area, and they've determined that there are 3. There's a moderate fire hazard severity zone, a high fire hazard severity zone, and a very high fire hazard severity zone. So there are high and very high fire hazard severity zones in there, but there is also a moderate fire hazard severity zone. So if this disclosure is marked yes, it does not mean that a property is in that high or very high fire hazard severity zone. It's possible it could be in that moderate fire hazard severity zone, and the seller does not have those additional seller disclosure requirements regarding home hardening retrofits. However, in some of the areas where fire hazard areas are more prevalent, some brokers have recommended that even in all of the state responsibility areas, so these wildland areas, to include the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory. And that's a conversation for you guys to have between you and your broker. If you guys want, we have it set up in our NHD system that if you guys do want it to be included for every property that is in a state responsibility area, we can include that automatically in your NHD so that the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory is included in the report. We take care of that checkbox for saying whether or not a property is in that high or very high fire hazard severity zone, and we can get it into your transaction for you and kind of monitor it from that perspective of the fire hazard severity zones. So just a quick recap, wildland areas contain moderate, high, and very high fire hazard severity areas. So if it's checked yes, it doesn't necessarily mean the seller has those additional disclosure requirements because it could be in a moderate fire hazard area. Now that we understand kind of what a state responsibility area is, let's talk about a very high fire hazard severity zone, because this particular disclosure gets a little bit tricky and is defined in the civil code as being an area designated by the director of CAL FIRE as being in a very high fire hazard severity area that is not in a state responsibility area like it was mentioned, in the previous disclosure. Suffice that to say, if a property's in a wildland area, regardless of the fire hazard class for that property, the very high fire hazard severity disclosure will always be marked no. So just because it's marked no doesn't even mean the property's not in a very high fire hazard severity zone. It's kind of misleading, but this is designed to disclose the areas where local areas agencies are responsible for fire protection in that area, and those properties have a very high fire hazard severity risk for that property. So they're kind of mutually exclusive here between the very high fire hazard severity zone, and the wildland area. So this is not really a great disclosure because it's entirely possible for this property to be marked no as being in a very high fire hazard severity zone, but the property still could be in a very high fire hazard severity zone in the wildland area. Not to mention, this doesn't even address the high fire hazard severity zone. It's a little bit complicated. I know that's incredibly nuanced, but let me show you where you can look in an NHD from SnapNHD to get a very clear determination on whether or not the property is in a very high fire hazard severity zone. We cut through all the nuance. We get rid of all the ifs, the ands, the buts, and the different ways that these disclosures work through the civil code. And we just make it very clear for you guys. So this is the first page of our NHD report. We're going to scroll down to the second page of our NHD report. And for those of you guys that have ordered with us before, you're probably familiar with our report snapshot page. This is kind of a summarized overview of all of the information that's in the report. We call out some of the big disclosure, the big disclosures in the report just to make them as available as possible and kind of summarize some things for you. Like, hey, there's 3 additional disclosures that are marked in for your review. Go take a look at those. But what I specifically wanted to point out is this section right here in our NHD, in the snapshot page. We're specifically talking about whether or not a property is in a high or a very high fire hazard severity area. Cue into the wording that is used there, the high or the very high fire hazard severity area. We wanted to match it up right here with this particular information that's included in the car form HHDA so that you guys can match those up and understand, hey, this information that's on the snapshot page is specifically to be used for the HHDA. If this particular snapshot page was to say that this property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, it would state right here that car form HHDA may be required in that transaction, just to call some more attention to the fact that the sellers may have some additional disclosure requirements with their transaction. If you are ordering an NHD from us, this is the particular section here, right here, page 3, which is where a flood cert would be provided if it was available, but we would also include car form HHDA for you, and it would be included in the NHD right here up front on page 3 in the NHD. But scrolling past that, we can get to our table of contents, which is a much more detailed 2-page overview where we list out every disclosure and advisory we have in the NHD. And we also tell you whether or not the property is in or out of the particular zone as it is determined in the NHD. And you'll see right here, we have, the California natural hazard disclosures. We're referring to all of the questions that are on the natural hazard disclosure statement itself. And then right below that, everything else that's included in the report, including the home hardening and defensible space disclosure that we were just looking at earlier in the presentation. Jumping back to our other report, it would take you back to our home hardening and defensible space disclosure. Like I said, where we make, again, a very clear determination there. This property is in a high or very high fire hazard severity area, and that the car form HHDA may be required. While we're here, I also want to point out this section of our disclosure for the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory. If this property is in one of these high or very high fire hazard severity areas, we will also include contact information if it's available for the CAL FIRE unit that's responsible for that county. That way you guys know who to call or what phone number to call if you want to schedule one of those final inspection reports or the defensible space inspections from CAL FIRE. We'll provide that contact information for you. So those are the spots to look at in the NHD. You want to specifically look for a disclosure that is meant to be used and paired with the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory from CAR, so that you're possibly not missing a disclosure when you should have it because of some of the other fire disclosures in the NHD. But you have a very clear idea of when it is supposed to be used, and we have created the home fire hardening disclosure and advisory for that purpose. So that kind of wraps up our presentation. I know we have a couple of questions in chat. If you guys do have any questions, please ask. We have a couple of minutes here to answer some of those questions. But if at any time down the road later, feel free to reach out to John Wax and ask some questions. He'll always be able to know how to get in touch with me. So you guys are more than happy to call me and ask any questions, because it might be that you guys mostly deal with residential property, in the city, and you don't deal with this very often, but one of your clients has a cabin up in Big Bear or something, and now, that you're 2 years later, you're being faced with this information for the first time. More than happy to talk you guys through it and go over that specific property for you. So reach out to John Wax or your local rep, and feel free to ask us some questions about this. We're always happy to help. So I've got a question here from Sylvia. Says that you mentioned that the inspector's heavy season is when? So wildfire season is about April to October, depending on the year. And during those times is when CAL FIRE staffs up for more inspections. And so CAL FIRE generally has more inspectors on staff from April to October or around that time frame. And they're seasonal. So outside October to April through winter, they don't have as many inspectors. And so it may be difficult to get inspections done during that time, or it may just take longer to get one of those inspections done. Hopefully that answered your question, Sylvia.
Also, Chris, our
yeah.
reports are known as the SMART report, because in the table of contents, you can click right on anything there and it will deliver you to the page that has the explanation, just like the home hardening and defensive space disclosure page right there that you just pulled up.
Absolutely. So yeah, for those of you that didn't see that, what John was referring to is if you are looking at our table of contents, all of these headings in here are links, and you can click on them and they will take you to the appropriate section in the NHD that is talking about this information. So if you wanted more information on the home hardening and defensible space disclosure, simply click on that listing in the table of contents and it will jump you to the disclosure in the report. Any other questions?
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for your time.
Yes.
Anyone else have any questions? Chris is here. You got to take advantage of him. He knows what's going on. He's our compliance officer with SnapNHD, and we're just so happy to have him.
Yes, I don't see any other question there. I just wanted to compliment you, Chris, on your voice. Your
Thank you.
voice is so smooth. It makes me feel like I'm on an airplane and directed by the pilot.
Thank you.
You have a very nice speaking voice.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, did everybody get all the information? Now it's John will give us a little more information on that, and then we'll have Pauline back on the spot. Go ahead, John.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. I've been a loyal affiliate for over 20 years. I appreciate you guys. I'm your resource. I'm here for you. Remember, order these up front. There's no penalty to you or your clients for having this information up front. And it may be a great tool that if you're going up against other agents, you have the information, just like you get your preliminary title report, get that information up front, have it available. If they ask you questions, you're able to answer the questions and also prepare them for what they need to do to have the home sold smoothly. And my information's in the chat for more information or place orders or whatever you guys have and need. And without further ado, I will turn it back over to you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Keep them in mind for your transactions and keep what he just said. The information is better to have it handy before you rush out. Now, escrows are closing very quickly. We got to have everything handy right away. So anyway, let's thank you, John, very much. Thank you, Chris.
Welcome.
Okay, and here we go, Pauline.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Chris, John, and Sylvia for this wonderful section. We thank you for your expertise and valuable information to us regarding the NHD and home hardening. It's very important nowadays. And we would like to invite you come back in person if that's allowed for reopen. If you have any further questions, please contact Chris and John directly. On behalf of West and Gabriel Valley Realtors, we would like to thank again for Mr. Chris Woods, John Wax from SnapNHD for your wonderful presentation today. We really hope to see you in person very soon. A quick reminder, tomorrow at 12 noon, come to see our 3 younger realtor to give us top producer panel to see how young people, they working on the deals. we might be learning something from them. Okay, and next Monday, 11 o'clock, April 26th, very important topic, personal cyber securities. From the speaker is Isaac Kim. He will give us a lot of information and how to secure your personal data, and hope you come to learn together. Thank you again, Chris, John, Sylvia, Fang, and all of you joining together today's beautiful class. And stay safe, stay happy. We see you tomorrow, 12 noon.
Thank you. See you tomorrow. Thank you all. Appreciate it
Yes.
very much.